All right, guys, welcome back to the Yes Means Yes pod. I already messed up. It's been a minute. Okay. I'm gonna and then restart. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us on the Yes Means Yes podcast. As usual, my name is Faith Nomchef. I am the ARP Counseling and Outreach Coordinator with the Rape Counselors of East Alabama. We have on a special guest today, Dr. Elizabeth Jeglic. I'm going to let her introduce herself in a moment, but I'm going to go ahead and let a new face with us on the podcast introduce herself as well, KJ Ray. So I'm going to go ahead and let her say hi, tell you about what she does with RCEA, and then we'll let Dr. Jeglic go on.
Okay, hi guys. My name is KJ. I'm with Rape Counselors as well. I am the Prevention Education Coordinator. And what I do is I go to different communities, schools, and wherever I can to just teach and talk with the kids or anybody in the community about preventing sexual assault and rape and things that we can do to be pro-social citizens and bystanders whenever we're encountered in situations.
So we're glad to have you on for the first time, KJ, and hopefully have you on for some following podcasts for sure. Uh, Dr. Jeglic, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself and we'll kind of get into the topic of the podcast today?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here today. I am a professor of psychology at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York, and my research focuses on sexual violence prevention. So that's kind of what I broadly study, and we'll talk about some of that here, some of the research that we're doing here today. So I'm excited to share that with you.
Yes, and we're very excited to have you on and talking about the topic of the podcast today, which is adult sexual grooming. So kind of give us the introduction. I had never heard of this kind of topic before. We had you on a few months ago for a lunch and learn to talk about marital rape and coercion. So this is something that I was kind of intrigued by because obviously I feel like in this realm of work, we've heard about grooming, but maybe not the concept of adult sexual grooming. So could you give us just kind of an overview of what that is?
Sure, and thanks for bringing me on to talk about this topic. This is kind of an emerging topic in research, and we're just starting to do it right now. So it's really something that we are investigating. But most of you have probably heard at this point of child sexual grooming, and those are the preparatory behaviors that a perpetrator engages in order to sexually abuse a child and prevent detection and disclosure. And so that's been pretty well researched and established in the domain of child sexual abuse, where children cannot give consent to sexual behavior. However, similar to children, the majority of adult sexual abuse, as you all know, is perpetrated by somebody who is known to the individual as an adult. So these are friends, family. It's not the stranger that we see in the dark alley. While that still can happen, it is not it's kind of in less than 20% of the cases. And so that really led us to think about, how is sexual abuse perpetrated when the person is known? And we've been talking, generally in the IPV literature, the interpersonal violence literature, and the sexual abuse literature about, constructs like coercion and sexual harassment and coercive control. But those just explain like little pieces of it. They don't provide a general overview. And then what was coming up, and because I do the sexual grooming research in children, was that people were using that term and applying it to adults. And so my colleague Georgia Winters and I, who do this work together, started looking at the research on adult sexual grooming. And while there were mentions in the popular literature on it, there really wasn't any research on it. There was one chapter that talked about it, which largely overlapped with our conceptualization of child sexual grooming, but that was really it. And so we wanted to just kind of explore this more and look at it from an empirical perspective. And so that's kind of where our research is at present.
Yes. And I know you obviously when we hear grooming, and as you kind of said, you kind of go to the concept of the child grooming, the child
Yeah.
sexual abuse that we're familiar with. How would you say that adult sexual grooming kind of differs from the population of it being like child grooming?
Sure. So let me just give you a little background on our child sexual grooming model, and we can kind of talk about where there are differences and similarities. So we proposed, based on the research available, and we content validated with experts, the sexual grooming model of child sexual abuse, where perpetrators select children who are vulnerable, either psychologically or because they lack guardianship. They then go on to gain access to them and isolate them. So they separate them from family and other individuals, and they get them in private because most sexual abuse happens when others are not around. They then engage in what is kind of the hallmark of the sexual grooming process, the trust development phase, where they use positive strategies to prey on the vulnerabilities of the individual. So they give them, they portray themselves as being caring and kind and nice, and they give the children attention and love and, kind of things that they're lacking. And so they feel that connection with the individual, which then leads to the fourth stage, which is the desensitization to sexual content and touch. And that's where they start crossing those boundaries, either by using language that's inappropriate or talking about sexual topics or starting to touch the child at first innocently, kind of like hugs and, touching on the back, and then becomes increasingly sexual, at which point those boundaries are crossed. And the contact abuse happens. And then we proposed a fifth stage, which is the post-abuse maintenance, which is kind of like where they tell the child, that not to tell anybody, or they make them feel like it was normal what they did, or that they're somehow responsible, which creates those feelings of guilt and shame and prevents the disclosure and detection. And as we know, sexual abuse is one of the least disclosed crimes because a lot of people don't tell anybody, or they don't tell anybody for a long time after it happens. And so when we think about adult sexual abuse, we don't really think about it in the same way. But what was really interesting to us was that when we gave our questionnaire, that we identified these 42 behaviors in 5 stages to adults, they pretty much reported the same things across the board with very few differences. They reported, that they were vulnerable, lots of psychological difficulties. Some may have had, a lot of them had, about 20% had a history of sexual abuse themselves, either in childhood or in adulthood. We know there's, once you experience sexual victimization, you're at increased risk. There were also some that reported, substance abuse issues, but largely it was just those psychological vulnerabilities and mental health concerns. They then gained access to them and isolated them. And so they worked, a lot of them reported that they were people that they knew in their environment, like coworkers or bosses. So that's where that sexual harassment piece comes in, about 20%. But they also reported that they kind of separated them psychologically and physically from their family and friends. And so, they kind of said, I'm the one that now cares about you. I'm, what we see in the interpersonal violence literature, a lot of that. The difference in that stage was that they did not try to separate or gain access to the family and befriend the family, which is what we see in child sexual abuse, because kids, need guardianship and adults don't, right? So, and then the third stage was pretty much identical, using a lot of those positive strategies. They reported the number one thing was that the person who perpetrated the abuse was well liked and well known in the community, right? So these are people that are upstanding citizens that we don't suspect of being sexual abusers. The same happens in child sexual abuse. And then they used a lot of those, I love you, you're special, give them a lot of attention, communicated with them often, all those similar types of things. The biggest difference that we saw between children and adults was in the fourth stage of the desensitization to sexual content and contact. And that's because adults obviously can give consent to sexual behaviors, right? And because these are people who are known to the adult and often current or former sexual partners, they haven't already engaged in potentially consensual behaviors with that individual. Or it's less kind of boundary violating if a coworker puts your hand on their back or they give you a hug, right? So when we see an adult and a child hugging, it's kind of like, oh, that's not okay. But it might be a little bit more appropriate because adults, have a little bit more bodily autonomy. They have more boundary knowledge. And so they might. But what we did see is that they were reporting that they were pushing them to engage in sexual behaviors that they were not comfortable with. So they might have consented to some, but not others. Or it might be, more like BDSM or things that they did not feel. And that's what they were reporting in that desensitization stage, kind of pushing them in areas that they did not feel comfortable in. The contact sexual abuse happened. And then similarly to what we see in children, they were kind of, convincing them that what they did was okay, that they were on board with it. kind of what we term as gaslighting, I guess, so somehow making them feel like, what they experienced as sexual abuse wasn't actually sexual abuse, that this is kind of something that they misunderstood or miscomprehended. So largely from the data that we have to date, it seems like a lot of the behaviors that we're seeing in adult sexual abuse perpetrated by somebody known to the individual is the same as child sexual abuse. And so potentially this term sexual grooming actually does apply.
So kind of, do you think in the future you'd see it as almost like an all-encompassing umbrella term, just sexual grooming, rather than having kind of the differences between child grooming and adult sexual grooming?
I think potentially so. And, we were kind of thinking about how do we disseminate this knowledge to individuals? And because a lot of the stuff that kids are learning, they learn in school, right? With the passage of Aaron's Law in 38 states, schools are now required to teach, kids about sexual abuse prevention, which I think is great and I think is really important. But where do you teach adults, right? Like, where do you find that common place? But we're seeing a lot of the sexual abusive behaviors in adulthood, especially, by a known individual, happening around those early 20 years. And so if we kind of think about a continuum, as you kind of point out with the grooming, that maybe as the kids are aging out of school systems, because most of them are still in school until they're 17, 18, that in those senior years when most of them are still required to take, health, that we start talking about adult relationships and how these strategies that we know are present in children may also be present in adult sexual abuse. That might be a way to kind of to share that information and to really understand that. And I think, as people are learning more about child sexual grooming, kind of applying that to adult sexual abuse, I think is also helpful, because I think there's still so much of that like stranger danger myth going on out there as it pertains to rape of adults.
Yeah, yeah. And then I think also too, kind of with what I've kind of seen with just, the boom of social media over the past, 10 years, but even more so, I would say the past 5 years, and all of the information, you kind of hear things like gaslighting being used almost, and love bombing, which are very real concepts, but being used almost as buzzwords and maybe not always applicable. So kind of being able to have those fall under this and teach, what are the appropriate and proper definitions of those, and how do those play into a bigger issue?
Yeah. And we see that gaslighting coming in the post-abuse maintenance, and that love bombing coming in that trust development stage where they're giving the person like a lot of attention. What was interesting is that when we had the people kind of say yes or no, did this happen? And we also had them describe it. And what they were describing was not necessarily even just affection, but they were excessive affection, right? Like they wouldn't leave the person alone. And that really falls in line with what people are talking about in the love bombing. And so when we're thinking about future research, we did what was called our red flag study with children, where we looked at which of those behaviors, because a lot of them are very pro-social, right? Like showing affection and attention, and those are courtship behaviors, right? Like people who are, flirting and dating and things like that. So those are very normative behaviors. But at what point do they become indicative of something bigger? And so kind of the next step in our research is to do this kind of red flags where we compare those who've experienced adult sexual abuse to those who have not, and they complete the scales, and we compare the endorsement of these behaviors across those two groups. And we see like, okay, so people, when they're dating, they report these behaviors and they're also reporting it. So that might not be one that's really a red flag, but maybe this one is not reported in normal adult to adult interactions, but this one is reported in sexual abuse. So that becomes a red flag.
Yeah, so having a more clear idea of, like you said, it kind of, there's a line of what is normal
Yes,
for those types of relationships, and then what is too much, and how do you,
yes,
have that almost like that instinct, right, go off and not convince yourself that it's not
yes,
something to be concerned about. And I think that that's something that to especially women, and I'm also coming from a point of, we're in Alabama, there's a lot of social behaviors where we're conditioned to kind of just push away some of our instincts to make the room more comfortable for everyone.
yeah,
So I think that, talking about maybe some warning signs, like
yeah,
what to actually listen to when those red flags pop up, what have you seen? I know you said you haven't done the study yet, but what have you seen as some signs of maybe this is a relationship that is turning into adult sexual grooming, is going past the normal courting stage?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think overall we're seeing that people who are vulnerable, right, who have that low self-esteem are being targeted. And we know that, generally from the sexual abuse literature that people who are vulnerable unfortunately tend to get targeted. And then the social isolation. So they are kind of taking them away from their family or friends and are restricting their communication and access to others, right? That's the same thing that we're seeing in the intimate partner violence, that they often, in those domestic violence relationships, separate them. So that way, that person becomes the really important in their lives, and they're kind of not having those support systems or other people who are maybe saying, this doesn't really look okay, right? So they're kind of taking them away. So that's what, the preliminary data is suggesting. And then what we have proposed in the child sexual abuse, and we're studying it at present, and I think will also come into play in the adult, is in that trust development. It's the excessive use of, those strategies. So not showing attention and affection, which is normal in courtship behavior, but really that love bombing, right? Like where they're really like, I love you, you're special, like where they're really not, and where are you, kind of like, keeping tabs on you, they're communicating with you all the time. And while that there is a, normalcy to that in like that initial dating phase, when it's too much, when you feel it's too much, and when you're seeing this like, like 20, 30 texts a day kind of thing, maybe that's where we're seeing those red flags. And so we're going to compare the frequency of endorsement, of these types of behaviors to also see, like, is it not only that it's present, but it's present like in a lot more than it would be in a normal, healthy courtship kind of thing. So, and then really just pushing the boundaries. So we know in sexual coercion that it's really, like you're pushing people, like you're saying like, come on, come on, come on. And, there's, again, a little bit of that normatively, like we're socially conditioned for that, like to, have the man try to cross those boundaries and the woman to say no. But when it's continual and to the point where the person is uncomfortable, again, that's where those boundaries are being crossed. Or even, in the workplace, for example, if the conversation is too sexual, or those, touching boundaries are outside of what would be socially normative, that could be, a red flag. And then really once the abuse happens, that, the secrecy, that kind of making you feel responsible, even though you don't feel like you wanted it, I think would potentially also be those red flags. But we'll have to look at that empirically.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so sounds like a lot of kind of similar warning signs. We go in, and I think KJ internet dropped, so she had to hop off. Hopefully we'll get her back in a minute, but we actually are able to go in and do the Aaron's Law type information and education that we talked about. And we try to focus from like 6 through 12 on those healthy relationships and what those look like, and, what those don't look like, to give, kids that age that knowledge, because oftentimes they're not getting it right. That's not really something that's super talked about. And one thing that we try to do is looking at, kind of warning signs, just like you discussed. And from our standpoint too, we try to talk about, okay, what does it look like if maybe someone is a perpetrator of these actions too? And I know that a lot of your work seems to center around, like, obviously victims. I feel like you kind of have to, choose a side. You don't really go in both. But would you say that there are some warning signs that you kind of see come up often with perpetrators of adult sexual grooming?
So we've looked I started my career looking at perpetrators of sexual violence broadly, not necessarily from a grooming perspective, but just looking at kind of the behaviors that they engaged in. And that's the one thing, like there is really not like the typical perpetrator, right? There's not a prototype of somebody who's a sexual offender. If not, it would be a lot easier for us to catch these individuals. And so, what we've learned over time is that a lot of these people are people in our environment, right? That are, people that we know, that we trust. I mean, we do see there are some general risk factors, right? There's the dehumanization of women, or feeling that women are not egalitarian. So that's, they're more likely to believe that women have a responsibility to provide sexual behaviors, whether they're consenting or not. But, the people that perpetrate adult rape just tend to be generally more violent and aggressive. They may have a more extensive history of perpetration than child sexual abusers who generally don't have a documented history. So this might be somebody who in their lives have been, violent and aggressive generally, and then sexual violence is just part of that. But I think again, it's a lot of it is, people have motivations. They might have a higher libido or sex drive or more deviant sexual interests. And then that's coupled with access to an individual. And that's where that statistic of 80% are known to the individual. That access piece plays a really important role because they're in contact with that individual. And then those things, it's kind of what Michael Cito deems the motivation facilitation model. So there's a motivation to engage in it. And then there are disinhibiting factors like substance abuse, or people have what are called cognitive distortions where they've convinced themselves that the person wants it or that they have a right to have it. And then they have access to that individual. And that's kind of how the behaviors occur. But in terms of profiling, it's kind of hard to say that person is a sex offender if they've not had a history of that.
Well, that makes sense. From what, kind of obviously we've seen as well, like there's no set person, and also that contributes from what we've seen, I'm sure from what you've seen to the confusion with victims afterward, because they have a set idea in their mind what a rapist looks like or sounds like or how they act, and then they don't act like that, and then it's like, okay, well, how does this fit into my schema, right, of what that is and what sexual violence looks like? So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I should highlight too that men can be, and people who are transgender can be victims of sexual violence and perpetrators of sexual violence, and women can be perpetrators. So, the majority of sexual violence is male perpetrator, female victim, but it can be any permutation and combination as well.
For sure, for sure. So with your, kind of research, and this is obviously we are a rape crisis center, so we do education, we do talk about consent a lot, and something that, because I've been doing this for almost 7 years now or so, from when I was a college student, I think that something that's become more emerged is the concept of kind of looking at power and how power dynamics impact consent. So I was curious if you've seen any kind of interplay with, kind of adult sexual grooming and power and consent, and how those all affect each other.
Absolutely. And we see that, across the board, as you're mentioning in adult sexual abuse, these power and control dynamics. And I think when we talked about, the workplace sexual abuse, so you have the supervisor, the boss who has power and control over you, who is then crossing boundaries. Like, how do you then, come forward with that? You have people who are more powerful in a relationship because they have the money, they have the status than you. And so that all comes into play, I think, in that, gaining access and the trust development stage, but also in the post-abuse maintenance, because they say, I am this person with power. Nobody is going to believe you. Or if you do this, or if you go forth and tell, then I am going to kind of quash you because I have that power and control. And so, I think while some of us may be drawn to those people initially, and that might be something that's attractive as that power has been wielded against, the individual to abuse them and to push them into do things that they don't feel comfortable in for fear of retribution because the power that they possess. And that is part of that whole dynamic, right? So we see elements of sexual coercion there. We see elements of, sexual harassment, coercive control. All those things that we're seeing in the interpersonal violence literature can also be then brought into kind of the larger construct of sexual grooming.
So we are coming from a standpoint of obviously a rape advocacy center, and our advocates are always looking for, new ways to kind of be up to date, right, with evidence-based practices, with literature, with new research. What ways do you think advocates could help kind of like on the ground level with bringing awareness to this issue and, focusing prevention efforts or education efforts on adult sexual grooming?
So as I mentioned, I think this is still emerging research, right? So I don't want to say change everything that you're doing. I think a lot of the models that we have kind of fall into this. This is just kind of a way of kind of understanding the story, I guess, from start to finish and really explaining how this happens to inform prevention efforts, as you mentioned. I think, similarly to what we're doing with childhood sexual abuse, I think it's really important to understand that, we need to provide services for those who are vulnerable, and so that we give people opportunities to get mental health and to get self-esteem and things like that. But we don't want to put the onus on the individual because they're the ones who are being victimized, right? So at the same time, we also then, from a bystander perspective, have to educate others about what these boundary behaviors look like. What to do if they're seeing them, like those bystander interventions. And I think, what are these behaviors? Because again, a lot of them are the same behaviors that we're already targeting, but if you understand it more, like if you already understand child sexual grooming, it's easier to then translate that to adult sexual grooming and saying, this person might be in danger, let's kind of separate them, or this might be a red flag, let's talk to them or talk to HR or talk to whoever, if you're seeing this in the workplace. And then family and friends, if you're seeing it in the relationship or in the home, that you're talking to that individual, although it's harder because they're adults too, right? And so we have less control over individuals. With a kid, you can physically say, you're not seeing this person anymore. With an adult, we know that doesn't go so well. If we're saying, the person that you're in a relationship with or that you are close to is violating these boundaries, you need to leave them. But, being aware and sharing that information, I think, can still at least plant that seed. And then just being there to support individuals if they should experience sexual abuse. And I think what's been helpful, and the survivors that I've talked to when they use this conceptualization, is really to understand how they were manipulated and that it's not their fault. Because I think similar to what we found in child sexual abuse, there's a lot of guilt and shame that this process because the boundaries are crossed gradually and the person doesn't really say yes, but they don't really say no either, right? It's not like that violent rape that we think the person is like holding them down and, physically hurting them. It happens gradually over time. And oftentimes they just didn't say no, but they didn't want to do it. And so it's not that they are consenting, but that they feel like they somehow are culpable, that they said, they hung out with this person, they dated this person, they said yes before to this person. And therefore, when something happened to them that was non-consensual, that they didn't want, that it somehow that it was their fault. And so really understanding this whole process and this manipulation and the psychological strategy that perpetrators use, I think absolves people of the guilt and shame, which then helps them heal from the trauma, because we know that the guilt and shame is what keeps the trauma going.
Yeah, for sure. And just, I think, like you said, having that education piece of realizing what's happening, right? Rather than feeling, isolated and alone and confused, but having words and, education backed things to explain this is what is happening and sharing that for sure.
Absolutely. I think
Yeah.
having language and understanding of the process is really very helpful, both in prevention, but also in treatment.
Yeah.
Folks have already experienced it, unfortunately, but I think it really helps to really absolve people of this is my fault somehow, and it's not your fault. It's never your fault. It's always the perpetrator's fault.
Mhm. For sure. Um, so has there been anything, it sounds like you've been kind of in this field for a long time. Has there been anything you have found in this work in regards to adult sexual grooming that's surprised or shocked you, as you've done it? And what kind of made you come across this topic and decide, hey, I'm going to kind of look at this specific research, right? Because you said it was a kind of new and emerging type thing.
Yeah, so as I said, this is something that's been around in child sexual abuse for a while. We've been talking about it. And my colleague and I have been, some of the first to look at this empirically. And I think, you know, the lot of the research on adult sexual abuse is focused on that stranger rape. And there was a really important study that came out of the UK, where they looked at, over a period, I think, of 2 or 3 years, all the people that came to a police station for reporting sexual abuse, adults. And they found that not one single one of them met the kind of the stereotypical definition of a typical rape, where there was force or violence, or the person said no and yelled and screamed and it was a stranger, or it happened in a dark alley. And so I think it's really important, because I think a lot of people, like, while we're starting to recognize that in child sexual abuse, the perpetrator is a known individual, we still don't really have that as a society. I still think we are believing in that stranger myth. Stranger, that the person is like, there has to be like a sign of violence, there have to be physical damages, the person has to yell no. I see it in court, like, why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you go away? And so really understanding how this grooming process happens and that manipulation, I think, is so important. And then in terms of just getting into it, because, I do study sexual grooming, I think I was just, getting questions about it from adults, and they were saying, like, I've been groomed, and I was saying, what do you mean you've been groomed? And they reported, and we did a case study on this, an analogous experience to what we were seeing in child sexual abuse, which then led to this kind of what we're calling our adult grooming study. We're just in the final processes of writing that one up and getting it published. But we have over 500 survivors of adult sexual abuse who completed our questionnaires. And so I think it will start the conversation, and we're aiming to get more research and data out there. So I think, this is something that in the next decade or so, we'll be talking about a lot more as it pertains to adult sexual abuse.
Um, so I think that, this is definitely a topic that I personally am excited to learn more about, and see, once you continue your research and more research comes out about it, I think that it definitely, like you said, kind of giving the language to what is going on, what's happening. So I think that this is a topic that we will definitely not be hearing the last of, hopefully, right? It's gonna be something that's gonna keep going, hopefully, and increasing and being more widely known. Similar to the concept of child sexual grooming, which 50 years ago I
Absolutely.
not heard of.
Yeah.
So we ask, each of our guests who come on our podcast is just kind of like a final question. What is your message to survivors of sexual violence?
I think that it is never your fault. And that if you feel like something is not right, that it probably isn't right, and trust your gut. That this is a psychological manipulation, and it happens gradually over time. And so, even if it doesn't look like that stereotypical rape, that doesn't mean that it is not. And so really, make sure that you are, thinking about this more holistically, looking at how this is happening, and whether that you feel okay in this relationship and that you feel safe. And if not, there are people like your organization that are here to help and to provide resources to keep you safe. So, I think the biggest thing is just when things don't feel right, when you don't feel comfortable, trust your gut, because that's what that psychological manipulation is doing. Is it's kind of trying to supersede those gut feelings that you have with somebody, so that they're pushing those boundaries and abusing you in ways that you or hurting you in ways that you do not consent to. So
Well, thank you, so much for joining us and being willing to speak on this topic. I feel like this is, a great one to put out there, and also will hopefully help bring awareness to the topic, with like podcasts and videos and learnings like this. Before we say goodbye, is there any, final comments, anything else you want to say or share before we end the podcast?
just thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate you giving me the forum to share some of our emerging research, and hopefully I can come back again in the future and give you some more updates as we continue the work that we're doing.
Yeah, no, that would be great. I would love to kind of see where those studies go, especially with kind of the red flags that you're
Yeah,
seeing and kind of the differences. I think that would be awesome to discuss on a future one. So we'll have to
absolutely. Well,
check
thank
back
you.
in maybe 2026, right?
Yes, we hope so.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of our listeners who have tuned in, and we will plan to see you on the next podcast. Bye.
Bye, thank you.